Good morning, Bible class. Welcome to Crash Course Bible lesson number 3. Today we will be looking at the Israelites and their exodus out of Egypt and the foundation or formation of their nation and the time of the judges. So, recap to where we're starting. Lesson 1, we learned about creation, fall, right? And then God putting his plan of redemption in lesson 2, calling Abraham and his family and establishing a lineage or a line of people that were born to Abraham who would be the nation of God's choosing. And so all those who were found in him were or born to Abraham were part of the covenant, or from Isaac, part of the covenant that the Lord established with him to bring redemption to save the whole world. Now we're up to part 4, Moses and God saving Israel or the Hebrew back, or taking them back out of Egypt and continuing his promise to Abraham. So this is lesson 3, the nation. I like that. The nation that will bless all nations. So the books we'll be looking at are Exodus. It's the story of God delivering and guiding the Israelites from Egypt out through the 10 plagues, the um, the Red Sea, the covenant in Mount Sinai, where he basically makes a wedding proposal and um, commits himself to Israel and to be their God, and he is the one who's upholding the covenant. And really, it's incredible that God would choose a stubborn and stiff-necked people like the Israelites, like us, really, to show his love to. Then the next book is Leviticus. It shows God's holiness. It shows how he is still love and he is still 100% holy and just. And so how does he do this? He does this by providing us with his law. There's um, Deuteronomy also, and Numbers there's the law in there as well, but this is the incredible part, is that God would care so much about us being right with him that he would give us his law in the book of Leviticus. Some of it is for holiness, some of it is for health, but all of it is to glorify God. And so that's what we want to do with our life as well. So the book of Leviticus then goes to the book of Numbers. It's a book about the time of wandering. So after they were delivered from the the Egyptians, the Israelites spent quite a bit of time wandering in the wilderness, actually 40 years. And so Book of Numbers is post-Egypt uh, wandering. It has some of the law in it as well, but it is also just a book that continuously goes back and just continuously shows us how God is fulfilling his promises to Abraham through his people. And then Deuteronomy, it's the second law, is thought to be read and written right before the Israelites were to enter the promised land. So it would be a reminder. As you might recall, there was a time of 40 years of wandering as one generation, the rebellious generation that God brought out of Egypt, died off. And then he established the promised land with the second generation, and that's under Joshua. Joshua is the book, but also a person. Joshua was the man who succeeded Moses as God's servant to lead the Israelites to the promised land. It's Joshua. His book starts with the spying out of Canaan, Rahab and the spies, delivering Jericho, and then the process in which all of Israel is won through war, um, through a lot of bloodshed, but they establish the kingdom of Israel in the land of the Canaanites, the Hittites, and there's just a long list. Um, After that, we looked at the book of Judges. It's a story about Israel's chaos and how Israel follows this same pattern of they follow God, then they intermix with the local people, or they accept the gods of them, and then they abandon the holy God for other little g gods. Israel suffers. God hears their prayers, and he provides for them a rescue, a refuge, and a calling back to himself, and then it's the same. So God provides for them, they follow him, then they abandon him. Israel suffers, God intervenes. So the themes that we are going to look at again are God's provision, how he provides for his people, his commitment to his covenant, how it is him keeping the covenant, just like Abraham. It's all God, not us. We break it every second of the day. God's power and holiness. We see that in Mount Sinai and the 10 plagues. And then coming out of the water, the Red Sea, again, just like in the story of Noah, people coming out of the water, God and his promise and his desire and his washing of us and his setting us apart and longing for us is just again a picture of water coming out of the water, just like Noah. We'll learn again with baptism. And then another theme is it shows us how deeply our sin is in bondage to slavery. And we see that through the people of Israel and how no matter what God has done for them, they're freed from slavery. They're not working for a master. They're not being whipped. Their babies aren't being taken away from them and killed. Yet they still want Egypt. They still see Egypt as a better solution or a better way of life and a better hope than God and his provision for them. And so we'll get into that right away. Exodus, okay, the book of Exodus. How it goes is Moses, okay, he's the main character. He's born a Hebrew. His mom was a Hebrew, and then he was raised as a prince in the house of Pharaoh, his daughter, and so a princess, and she raised him in the history, the language, everything of the Pharaoh and the Egyptians. When he was older, he was walking out and he saw a man whipping or beating a Hebrew, and he says, "What are you doing?" And so he ends up striking and killing this man, buries him in the sand, and runs away. He runs away into the wilderness where he meets these girls taking care of sheep, helps them, ends up marrying one of the girls, and becomes a shepherd running away from his past. God finds him, calls him through a burning bush to rescue Israel. Moses, we'll get into him a little bit later, and that's just an overview of who he is. He goes, he listens, and he is God's vessel for bringing deliverance to the Israelites. Pharaoh, he was the king of Egypt, thought of himself as a god, so he would be worshipped. Um, he was really just the untouchable person in that era. So he enslaved God's people. Many crimes were committed against them, injustice and the outcry and the enslavement of God's people got up to God's ears, they say, and he acted by sending Moses. Um, the his love for himself and being God ultimately led to his destruction through the 10 plagues. The 10 plagues is a display of God's strength and his might. Um, It's his authority over creation, over the rule of the world. And for so many of those plagues, those were also things that the Pharaoh claimed to be God over, or that Egyptian gods were, they had the sun god, right? They had the river god, all these things. But God turns it into blood. He hides the sun. He kills, right, every animal. He brings frogs out of it, right? There's gnats. Like, it's just terrible, terrible things that came out of these 10 plagues. But really, it was a display of you're not who you think you are, O Pharaoh, and your people. This is who the true God is, the only living God, and it is the I am of the Hebrew. And so Moses, through his brother Aaron speaking, they continuously go to Pharaoh, let my people go. We want to go and worship. And then at the end of the 10 plagues, eventually the Egyptians are like, go, leave us. We can't take any more of your God bringing destruction upon our country, our land, our families. And so they send them away and they give them gifts. And so they plunder the earth or plunder the Egyptians, taking all their gold. And some Egyptians even join them. They're so convinced of God as God that they join the Egyptians. Oh, their exodus. Sorry about that. So the Red Sea, after they're leaving, they're on the way out. Pharaoh, who had a hard heart, has seen all of his free labor leave. After waiting a little while, he's like, what am I doing? I'm so dumb. So he goes after them with his army. While he's going after them, the Israelites run into the Red Sea. They're being led by God, a pillar of fire at night and a cloud during the day. and it leads them, and they're stuck between the Red Sea and Pharaoh's army. And so God, through his servant Moses and his staff, makes a pathway, a dry path right through the middle of the Red Sea. All of Israel goes across. Pharaoh gets up to it, sees that there's a path going right across the Red Sea. He's like, well, I'm taking it. So he sends his whole army through. When they get right to the middle, and it all of a sudden becomes wet again. And the dry land that the Israelites walked across becomes muddy. They all get enclosed in the water as it recedes back, and Pharaoh and his army are sunk and lost in the sea. And it's a great victory, and really the ultimate victory, because um, that tie of Pharaoh having rule over them was gone. They have been cut off. They have come out of the water. They have died to their life of slavery, and now they are free, and free in God's will and in his plan, just like us when we are baptized. So after this, they start walking, right? They got to get to the promised land. There's no train, no airplane, or buses, or Gojek. It's just them on their feet with what they have, driving their sheep and other things along with them. So as they go, they're free from Egypt, but they start to grumble. They're like, what is going on? We're in the wilderness on our way to the promised land, but we don't have any food. We don't have water. Okay, and so all these things, oh, we should have just died in Egypt. It would have been better for us to be a slave in Egypt than to be out here. And so God, through his mighty hand and plan, just provides for them again and again. And so every morning, except for Sunday or Saturday, the Sabbath, they would wake up and there would be bread on the ground all over. Like it's a miracle that happened every day. Okay? And so every day they woke up to God providing them with bread. Water came flowing out of rocks. Bad wells turned good. Every night quail would fly in just for them to kill and eat, and still they grumbled. Every single day they witnessed a miracle, yet their hearts were still enslaved to Egypt. And so um, Exodus is a story of God providing, and God delivering, and God setting out to love his people even when they don't. And so during their time of wandering or walking through the wilderness, they come to the mountain called Sinai. It's here where God makes a covenant with Israel. It's 40 days of a mountain um, being covered with a cloud, lightning strikes, bolt, and it's earth shattering. It's scary. All the people are trembling in fear, and they're called to go up the mountain, but they they send one, Moses. Moses is the only one to go up to meet God, and God gives him the law to follow for his people, and they're called the Ten Commandments, and he writes them on a tablet, and so he sends them down. It's like, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, right? You shall have no other gods before him, no idols or images or anything. Um, honor your father and mother, right? We'll learn about these throughout the year, but the commandment to do not murder, do not steal, do not lie, all these things, they come to them. And as Moses is coming down the mountain after having God's power displayed for days, okay, is displayed in this law and given to them, and they disobey. There's a golden calf they're worshiping. Moses breaks them, has to go back up for another set, right? And yeah, it's just an incredible display of God providing for his people. Um, disobedience, it's often said the Israelites, they just can't get the Egypt out of Israel, and it's this continuous want for slavery. It's want for the gods there, it's want for the control that they had, it's want for the comfortability of being someone else's slave. And so through disobedience, through Moses hitting the rock um, instead of speaking to it for water, they are condemned to 40 years of wandering in the wilderness before God will deliver them to their final destination.